who knew Joseph was the apostles, okay, the apostolic leadership. Now, since there is a new Pharaoh, there must be a new church leadership. But this one, it says, knew not Joseph, okay? So we have a Pharaoh, or king of Egypt, who knew not Joseph. And since we know that Egypt is the world, and we have Joseph as a type of Christ, we're talking about a church leadership which knew not Christ, okay? So sadly this comes about, but this is what we are told of in Testimonies to Ministers, page 217, which says, "Grievous and presumptuous sins have dwelt among us, and yet the general opinion is that the church is flourishing, and that peace and prosperity, or spiritual prosperity, are in all her borders. The church has turned back from following Christ, Joseph, her leader, and is steadily retreating towards Egypt. Yet few are alarmed or astonished at their want of spiritual power. Doubt and even disbelief of the testimonies of the Spirit of God is leavening our churches everywhere. Satan would have it thus. Ministers who preach self instead of Christ would have it thus." And she continues on. But we see that there's a new class of ministry, or a new leadership of the church, which does not know Christ, which also in Testimonies to Ministers, page 148 and 149, it says, "It was shown to me that on the part of the ministers in all our conferences, there is a neglect to study the Scriptures, to search for the truth." Also, I was reading earlier today in the Ellen G. White 1888 Materials, Volume 1, and it says, there's a section from page 151 to 153, and it's the last talk that Sister White gave during the 1888 Minneapolis, Minnesota conference. And she speaks here of the same thing, of this new class of leadership, or the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, or leadership who knew not Christ. She says, "Now our meeting is drawing to a close, and not one confession has been made. There has not been a single break so as to let the Spirit of God in. Now, I was saying, what was the use of our assembling here together, and for our ministering brethren to come in, if they are if they are here only to shut out the Spirit of God from the people? We did hope that there would be a turning to the Lord here. Perhaps you feel that you have all you want." She says, "I've been talking and pleading with you, but it does not seem to make any difference." Okay. She also talks further down. She says that she compares us to the Jewish nation, or the leadership at that time to the Jewish nation. And she says here, she says, "God did not raise me up to come across the plains to speak to you, and you sit here to question his message, and to question whether Sister White is the same," and she's speaking of herself in third person, "Sister White is the same as she used to be in years gone by. I have in many things gone back and given you that which was given me in past years, because then you acknowledged that Sister White was right, but somehow it has changed now, and Sister White is different, just like the Jewish nation," she says. So here we're told that there's a new class of ministry, and this is emphasized particularly around 1888, and yeah, it's a very sad situation. Then it is that we are told statements such as, for example, Last Day Events, page 50 and 51. We're told, it says, the voice from Battle Creek, which has been regarded as the authority in counseling how the work should be done is no longer the voice of God. She says, "It has been some years since I have considered the General Conference as the voice of God, that these men should stand in a sacred place to be as the voice of God to the people, as we once believed the General Conference to be. That is past." Okay? That's Last Day Events, page 50 and 51. We're told similar things in many places, but the point being is that a new pharaoh or leadership that knew not Joseph or knows not Christ, and sadly we see the same thing in our very same church today, of a ministry that knows not Christ, for they rejected the message of the righteousness of Christ in 1888. Somebody puts here a quote which says, "The great issue so near at hand will weed out those whom God has not appointed, and he will have a pure, true, sanctified ministry prepared for the latter rain." And that's volume 12 of the manuscript for these series, page 327. And so what we're given is a different situation than what we have now in that reference, but we're being told that it will come about. And this line of types reveals to us how that comes about. Okay? So we're at the point now, and we've covered a few points, where we have actually come to the point of history of the history of the Adventist Church. And so the rest of this study will actually be dealing with the Adventist Church. Now, since I noticed here that there's nobody here with questions, that's why I've kind of continued on with this. But it is about 15 minutes until the close of the study now, and there are some questions that people sent me during the week. One relating to last week's study of Zechariah 4, which I stated to the person that I would answer in the last period of this study. And since it relates to this subject, I will go ahead and answer it anyways. So I want to point out a few things, though, that we passed over in relation to this study. Okay. Now, if we look at Genesis 41, we're going to see as part of the types, we're going to read verses 34, and then we're going to go to Genesis 42:23. Genesis 41:34 says, "Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years." Okay? So I want you to notice that there was officers appointed over the land. Now in Genesis 42, verse 23, it says, "And they knew not that Joseph understood them, for he spake unto them by an interpreter." Okay? So I want you to notice that there's officers that were used in the years of plenty, okay, to bring God's truth into the storehouse, okay, in antitypically speaking. So these officers here can be none other than God's prophets. But later we have in Genesis 42:23 Joseph speaking through an interpreter. Okay, so this is Christ in antitype speaking to us through an interpreter. Now this brings us back to the point that we found about the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. And Matthew 11:13 saying, "For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John." So what we have is the prophets of the Old Testament putting the word in the storehouse, in the Bible. Then the prophets of the New Testament interpreting or revealing that word. Okay? So I just want to point out that the role of New Testament prophets is interpretation of the Old Testament scriptures. Now, the question that was asked to me during the week was in regard to the 2 golden pipes in Zechariah 4. Now, if you remember the picture here, I'm not going to redraw it, but you remember that there was a candlestick, there was a bowl, there was 2 olive trees, there was 2 golden pipes going from the olive trees into the bowl, emptying the oil out. Then from the bowl there were 7 golden tubes going to the 7 lamps of the candlestick. Okay, if you haven't viewed that study, it should be, if you scroll down here, you should see it actually on this page. Also, we will be uploading it to a new YouTube channel at some point soon, and we will have the links also on this page. But the question was asked, how do we show, or how do you know that the 2 golden pipes going from the trees into the bowl represents God's prophets? How do we know that that represents God's prophets? Because that was a statement that I made last week, and I guess I did not supply as much evidence for that point as I had for others. Now, I do want to point out, though, that our purpose in these studies is not to prove everything to you, okay? Our purpose in these studies is just to introduce to you enough evidence, or show you the picture, so that you can be interested enough to go and study it yourself, okay? That is our purpose. So we're not trying to prove every point to you. So if you are leaving with questions and not everything is quite clear, I actually view that as a good thing, because it shows that there's a reason for you to study, okay? Since this question was asked, though, I will address it. I won't be covering every point in relation to this, since I can't. There's not enough time, and it would be good for you to do it on your own. But I do want to just deal with a few additional proofs for that symbol, okay, and how it ties into today's study. So in Zechariah 4, again, we found out last week that the bowl is the writings of the Spirit of prophecy, and the trees represent the Old Testament and the New Testament. So really, from just a standpoint of logic, what we have to find is, how do we get the truth or the oil from the scriptures into the writings of the Spirit of prophecy? Now, as Seventh-day Adventists, we say that Ellen G. White's writings are the Spirit of prophecy, and which they are. But what had to take place to get the truth from the Bible, which needed to be interpreted according to Joseph, the story of Joseph, speaking through interpreters, what needed to take place in order to get the truth from the olive trees, from the Bible, into the writings of the Spirit of prophecy? Meaning there is a missing piece there, a middleman, so to speak, from getting the truth from the Bible to the books of the Spirit of prophecy, okay? So here, for example, is a Spirit of prophecy book, okay? This is Manuscript Release, Volume 16. Now I have here my Bible. So it's a simple question of asking, what is the channel that God used to take the truth from this book and put it in this book? And if you open up any one of these books, it should tell you in the front. And in here, it tells us that this was written by Ellen G. White. Okay? In other words, God used her to interpret the scriptures and write it down into what we call the bowl, or the writings of the Spirit of prophecy. Now, we know that it must be a person that God uses to do this because of what the Bible says in Revelation. Now, in Revelation chapter 19, verse 10, we are told about the Spirit of prophecy, and it says here, Revelation 19:10, "And I fell at his feet to worship him, and he said unto me, See that thou do it not. I am thy fellow servant and of thy brethren